Okay, we are recording. Going to do something a little bit different for this video. This is going to be about mini-bosses. And I'm going to show you the mini-bosses before I actually get started. What I'm going to do first is show you the mini-bosses and their behavior, and then I'm going to show you what it's like on the back end. Now, if you look closely, you'll notice that the eyes of this mini-boss are actually following me around as I walk. I mean, if you get close enough, then it begins to use a lightning attack. Don't know if you can see it very clearly, but its eyes are following me around. If I try to shoot it, generally it doesn't work. Ow. However, if while its eyes are down I shoot it, it'll take damage. And it'll fall off the screen with its eyes spinning. Let's see, I believe it is 30th file 5. This next one is called Spring Spessartine, and it's bouncing along towards me. Boing. And if I go underneath it, it gets stunned and becomes vulnerable much the same way. Boing. Boing. And once again, when it hits the ground, it becomes vulnerable and it can take damage. Now, there were several behaviors in each of them. The blue one was called Lightning Lapis, and the orange one was called Spring Spessartine. So let's go into what's required to make those. Now, remember, each transition is essentially its own behavior because it has its own animation to it. This is the main behavior for Lightning Lapis. It's simply move towards the player here, has a kind of a slow speed, no gravity. As terms of hitboxes, it should damage the player on contact. It says it should be able to take damage, but maybe I should have changed this label to should have collision detection with player bullets. As you can see, there are 16 different directions here. One of the reasons why I'm doing things this way instead of building it from scratch and letting you watch me build it from scratch like that is because if I did that, I would have to have all 16 of these, actually all 17 of these animations created, and we don't want that. There's no dialogue, and there's no global health or upon taking this much damage, switch to this behavior rule here. So basically what this means is it's going to absorb bullets, but it won't take damage. And this switch rule is when it's close enough to the player. There's a little icon here that tells you which switch rule it is. The little stick figure is supposed to be the player. There's a whole bunch of switch rules. There's if it's far enough down or to the left or to the right or up. Upon falling down, which is basically as soon as it falls off a cliff, it switches to another one. Upon hitting the ceiling or the ground or the wall, when it's near enough to the player, which is this, as soon as the NPC enters a given area. There's a lot of switch rules that I have not demoed. There's kind of too many to go through, so you'll just have to play around with them yourself if you want to see them. Anyways, if the NPC is close enough to the player, it switches to the focusing switch rule, and the focusing one is, as you may have guessed, one that's essentially a transition. As soon as it goes through one animation cycle, it goes to warning. Here's the animation. It sort of switches its eyes from vertical to horizontal as if it was squinting. And here I actually have a time switch rule. After 2 seconds, which is 200 milliseconds, it goes to zapping. Hitboxes, it should damage the player on contact. There's all these twinkles. I don't know if it's showing up in this video, but there's essentially a lot of twinkles. It's essentially meant to remind you of the way there are sparks before hurt zone fires up. Anyways, for 3 seconds, this zapping switch rule happens. And this one has a whole bunch of lightning in a square around the NPC. Again, there's no dialogue. The damage player on contact hitbox is huge, meant to go along with the square lightning. Should be able to take damage. Again, because there's no switch rule that says if you take enough damage, do this. Basically, it absorbs bullets, and then after the 300, it goes to fading. Fading is another one of these transition behaviors. Pretty much it's just there so that you can have a smooth animation showing the lightning on the sides fading and the eyes going down. Then here, for vulnerable, it actually will take damage. It chips away at the global hit points. Ooh, that one's off the edge. This one will actually chip away at global damage, or the global hit points. And if it takes 50 global hit points of damage, it will die. Reviving basically is another one of these transitions which takes it straight to reviving. Although while it's reviving, it'll still take damage. And it switches to move the player as soon as the cycles end, as soon as it goes through its animation cycle. So essentially it can cycle through that as many times as is necessary. So it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, actually 8 behaviors to it. The dying behavior, as soon as it leaves the bounds of the room, it despawns. And like the death throws animations for the trooper enemies, I use a bounce toward player movement rule. Give it 0 horizontal movement speed, 10 vertical movement speed, so it sort of bounces up and then falls down. The graphic is it spinning its eyes like this. There's no electricity on the sides. I figured this would do a pretty good job of showing that it's dead Jim. So that's what you have to get for a mini boss like Lightning Lapis. Now for Spring Spessartine, which is in a separate file, it's just about the same story. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's a difference though. You may have noticed that when Spring Spessartine was bouncing along, it would stop, sort of compress, and then go back up. I added that. It's called boing here. It just cycles through its animation once. Boing, boing. I also made the lightning bolts a lot squigglier to sort of say this is being compressed down. As soon as it cycles through one animation, it bounces to the player. And for bounce to player, I essentially have two different switch rules. There's, as soon as it hits the ground, it goes to boing, and it's got horizontal movement speed. It goes at a speed of 15 upwards as soon as it enters the switch rule, so it can go down, hits the ground, boing, goes back up. It's got block hitbox here, damage on contact, take damage, but of course, since there's no do this upon taking enough damage switch rule here, it will not actually take any damage. And this transition one, basically that's the switch rule that says I'm about to pound down onto the ground. And again, this is a transition switch rule that's goes through one animation cycle and then stops. Preview it. It actually switches its eyes a couple of times before it pounds the ground. Dropping. This one is bounces towards the player. -12, which in this case means it goes straight down. And as soon as it hits the ground, it goes to fading. Fading is again a transition switch rule where it goes through one animation cycle and then switches. I have these transition switch rules simply because that's the way you can have smooth animations that transition between different behaviors. It's got to be done somehow, so I figure this is one of the better ways of doing it. It goes from fading to vulnerable just like Lightning Law Piece. And with this one, the damage that it takes applies against the global hit points, and when it runs out of global hit points, it goes to dying, which is about the same story. And if it takes enough time, then it goes to reviving, which goes back to boing, which essentially makes it compress and then go back up and start jumping at the player again. Now, funny fact about this bounce to player, and as soon as it's close enough to the player, it does the transition. Let me show you what the canvas requirement is for that transition. While I have this guy selected, it is actually pretty hard to see, so I'm going to move him almost off the top of the screen. This is actually the switch rule, the canvas requirement for as soon as it gets close enough to the player. Essentially, the canvas requirement draws a box around Spring Spessartine, and if the player enters that box, then it triggers the switch rule. This is a very long and skinny box, so if the player is actually underneath Spring Spessartine, then it will switch to the pound down rule and it will try to slam down on the player. Basically, this is my way of mimicking essentially attack techniques. I don't have those as part of the game yet, but basically this, if you're close enough to the player, switch to another behavior, that can mimic a boss changing its attack pattern or starting an attack. But I definitely want to have things like projectile and melee attacks as part of the game later on. So basically that is how you'd put together a mini boss like this.